When the Mafia boss Dominic Vassallo came home early that night, he expected silence. Instead, he found his maid standing pale in the hallway, her hand trembling as she pressed a finger to her lips and told him not to speak. The mansion that usually felt untouchable now carried a pulse of danger, something hidden just beyond the walls. Dominic, a man feared across Chicago, realized this wasn't about business, it was about his home. What the maid was hiding upstairs would tear apart everything he thought he knew about loyalty, love, and the people he trusted most. Dominic Vassallo stepped into his Chicago penthouse, expecting to find the usual silence of a late night. The city lights glowed through the tall windows, casting reflections on the polished floor. He had returned early from a meeting at the docks, tired but restless. The night had been messy, another business dispute solved with violence. He wanted nothing more than to check on his children before sleeping. But the house didn't feel right. The air carried something strange, something that didn't belong to a man who ruled an empire built on fear and control. Something was waiting in the shadows. As he set his briefcase down, Dominic noticed the faint sound of movement. Not the sound of children playing, but a quiet shuffle, controlled and hesitant. He reached for the small pistol under his jacket. Then, at the far end of the hallway, his maid Elena Costa appeared. Her face was pale, eyes wide, hands trembling slightly. She didn't greet him or speak his name. Instead, she pressed a finger to her lips. The gesture stopped him cold. Dominic's instincts, honed from years of dealing with threats, told him this wasn't fear of him. It was fear of something else. He stared at her, trying to read her expression. She wasn't just scared, she was pleading. Her hand pointed toward the staircase, where the faint hum of a woman's voice drifted down. Dominic recognized that voice instantly. It belonged to Bianca Marino, his fiancée, the daughter of a man powerful enough to destroy everything he'd built. Dominic's stomach tightened. His children were supposed to be asleep hours ago. He mouthed a question, but Elena shook her head quickly. She stepped closer, whispering low, barely moving her lips, telling him not to speak. Her eyes begged him to listen. Dominic's patience was thin, but something in her fear made him obey. She motioned for him to follow. Together they moved silently through the corridor, past family portraits, and the marble stairs he'd installed when his late wife was alive. Each step felt heavier. He could hear muffled sounds coming from the playroom, voices, sharp words, and a small cry. Dominic's jaw clenched. He hadn't heard that kind of cry from his daughter since Isabella died. Elena turned and mouthed a warning. Dominic took a slow breath. Whatever waited in that room wasn't a simple argument. It was something worse. Elena stopped behind a wide marble column near the playroom entrance and motioned for Dominic to look. The door was open just enough to see the scene inside. His daughter knelt on the floor, small shoulders shaking. His son stood beside her, still and frightened. Above them, in her silk nightdress and heels, Bianca paced like a warden. Her words were sharp and cruel. Dominic didn't hear everything, but he caught enough to understand. She was calling them weak. She was calling their late mother weak. The children didn't move, trained already to stay quiet and endure. Dominic's hand curled into a fist, but Elena grabbed his wrist before he could move. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She shook her head again and pulled out her phone. On the screen, a video was paused. It showed Bianca in the same room, earlier that week, slapping his son across the face. His daughter cried in the corner. Dominic's stomach turned, Elena pressed play, and the sound of Bianca's voice filled the hallway, cold, controlled, without remorse. Dominic felt his chest tighten with rage. Elena whispered that there were 12 more videos like it, all recorded in secret. For a man like Dominic, silence was rare. He'd built an empire by speaking with power and demanding loyalty, but now his voice deserted him. He watched the screen, each new moment showing a piece of a life he hadn't seen. The fear in his children's eyes, the humiliation they'd endured. He looked at Elena, his mind racing. How long had this been happening? How had he missed it? Elena's expression held no judgment, only urgency. She whispered that Bianca only behaved like this when Dominic wasn't home, as if she wanted the children broken before his return. Dominic felt his throat go dry. He'd spent so many nights claiming everything he did was for his family, every deal, every violent choice, every enemy buried in the ground. Yet here, in his own home, his children had been living a nightmare he never noticed. Elena told him she'd been collecting proof for months, waiting for a moment when he'd finally see the truth. She said Bianca planned something far worse. Dominic wanted to demand details, but Elena only said one thing: if he made a sound now, Bianca would know, and the children would pay the price. From the room, Bianca's voice rose again. She told the children that their mother had been weak, that Dominic's softness toward them made him blind. Dominic's vision blurred red. His wife Isabella had died in a car crash 2 years earlier. Hearing Bianca use her name like that felt like a blade twisting inside him. He tried to move, but Elena held him back, showing him another clip, Bianca's phone call with someone she called father. In it she spoke about paperwork being ready and mentioned the words, "Children won't be a problem much longer." Dominic's rage turned cold. He leaned closer, realizing what those words could mean. Bianca wasn't just cruel, she was planning something permanent. Elena whispered that Bianca had arranged for the children to be sent to a boarding school overseas, but she believed it was a cover for something worse. Dominic's pulse hammered in his ears. He looked back into the playroom where Bianca now knelt before his daughter, forcing her to repeat words that made no sense for a child to say. He had never wanted to hit a woman in his life, but in that moment the thought crossed his mind. Elena whispered that Bianca was working with her father behind Dominic's back. Together they were setting up a transfer of his assets and preparing to remove him once the deal was done. Dominic could hardly breathe. His entire empire, the alliances, the respect, the wealth, had been built on loyalty and control, yet he was being outmaneuvered inside his own home. He watched as Bianca told his son to stand still and recite something under threat of losing food. The boy's lips trembled, but he obeyed. Dominic's fingers twitched toward his gun again. Elena shook her head, pleading with her eyes. He wanted to burst into that room and end it all, but Elena's words cut through the storm in his mind. She told him that if he acted now, Bianca would twist it against him. She would claim abuse, manipulate her father, and use their connections to destroy him legally and publicly. Dominic hated that she was right. He'd seen men like Bianca's father ruin others with a single phone call. The cost of one rash move could be everything, so he stayed where he was, seething in silence, realizing that patience might be the only way to save his family. Bianca's phone rang again. She answered quickly, pacing as she spoke. Dominic caught only fragments: plans for tomorrow night, documents to be signed, confirmation that everything was ready. Bianca said something chilling about his children not being a problem by the end of the week. She ended the call and smiled coldly, walking over to his daughter to stroke her hair like a pet. Dominic clenched his fists, every part of him screaming to act. Elena whispered that this was the proof he needed. They would bring Bianca down, but it had to be done smart, not loud. The children were finally sent to bed. Bianca walked away, leaving the playroom in eerie quiet. Dominic stayed hidden as his daughter and son passed by, their faces pale and distant. When his son looked up and accidentally met his eyes, the moment nearly broke him. The boy didn't cry out or react. He just gave a tiny nod, as if to say he understood. Dominic had never felt smaller, watching his own child act like the adult. He wanted to promise right there that he'd make it right, but all he could do was follow Elena's lead. Elena leaned close and whispered that Bianca always checked on the kids again around 3 in the morning. They had 1 hour to get them out and one chance to uncover what Bianca meant about the papers. Dominic finally spoke, his voice low and rough, asking who Elena really was. She hesitated, then said she wasn't just a maid. She had come into this house for revenge, to expose Bianca for something personal. Dominic's confusion grew as she mentioned a sister, someone who had died because of the Marino family. The truth behind that death would change everything. Dominic stared at Elena, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. She said her sister had worked for his company years ago, back when his late wife was still alive. The sister's name was Lucia Costa. Dominic remembered her vaguely, a young accountant who'd been killed during a mugging that seemed random at the time. Elena's eyes told him it hadn't been random at all. She explained that Lucia had been targeted because she uncovered illegal transfers connected to Bianca's father. Dominic felt his stomach twist as he realized how far the Marino family's reach had always gone. Elena said she took the housekeeping job under a false name to find out the truth. She had watched for months, seeing Bianca treat the children with cruelty and pretend to be the perfect fiancée in front of others. At first, Elena admitted she came for revenge, but after spending time with the kids, that changed. She had seen how lonely they were, how they waited every night for their father to come home, hoping he'd arrive before Bianca did. Dominic's silence deepened. His empire had made him powerful, but it had also made him blind. She led Dominic down a narrow service corridor behind the laundry room. At the end was a locked metal door he'd never noticed before. Elena pulled out a key and opened it, revealing a small hidden surveillance room. Screens flickered to life, showing footage from nearly every room in the penthouse. The recordings went back months. Dominic watched as scenes of his fiancée's cruelty played out again and again: verbal abuse, slaps, starvation, isolation. Each moment stripped away another layer of his denial. Elena had risked her life to gather this proof, and now the truth was in front of him. Dominic gripped the edge of the desk, feeling his pulse pounding in his ears. He asked how long Bianca had been doing this, and Elena told him it had started around 6 months ago, right after Bianca convinced him to merge business interests with her father. The abuse wasn't just personal, it was strategic. She was breaking his children's spirits to keep him compliant. Dominic's anger simmered into something colder, something dangerous. He realized he wasn't just dealing with a cruel woman, but with a calculated operation meant to destroy him from the inside out. Elena pointed to another monitor showing a feed from Bianca's study. There were files stacked neatly on her desk, marked with Dominic's company logos, contracts, transfers, and signatures prepared without his knowledge. Elena said Bianca and her father planned to finalize the takeover the next evening. Dominic stared at his own name on forged documents, the betrayal now undeniable. He took a deep breath, knowing one wrong step could mean death for his children. He had to act with precision, and for the first time in years he wasn't thinking like a boss, he was thinking like a father. Dominic turned to Elena and asked if she trusted anyone outside this house. She shook her head. Bianca had fired almost every old staff member and replaced them with her own people. Even the guards at the gate were Marino loyalists. Elena said there was only one ally left: Dominic's longtime driver Nico. He had been suspicious of Bianca for months. Dominic made a plan in his head. If he could reach Nico quietly, there might still be time to protect the kids before Bianca discovered he was home. The clock on the wall read 2:30. They had half an hour. They moved through the dimly lit corridor, using side paths to avoid cameras Bianca had installed. Elena carried her phone with all the recordings saved on it. Dominic carried nothing but his gun and guilt. When they reached the service stairs, he paused and told her he needed to see his children before doing anything else. Elena hesitated but nodded. Together, they climbed toward the children's rooms, every step echoing softly through the hall. Dominic had faced men with knives and guns, but this walk felt heavier than any shootout. He was heading toward his biggest failure yet. In the children's room, the lights were low. His daughter slept restlessly, her small hand clutching a blanket. His son Matteo sat awake in bed, staring at the wall. Dominic froze, realizing the boy wasn't startled by his presence. Matteo simply whispered that he couldn't sleep because she might come back. Dominic's chest tightened. Elena stayed by the door, watching silently. Dominic sat beside his son, gently brushing a hand through his hair, something he hadn't done since Isabella was alive. Matteo's eyes filled with tears, not from fear this time, but relief. His father had finally come home. Dominic whispered to Elena that they needed to get the children out immediately. She agreed but warned that Bianca often checked the rooms around 3. There wasn't much time. Elena went to wake Arya, the younger child, who blinked sleepily, confused but calm when she saw her father. Dominic carried her in his arms, while Matteo followed close, clutching Elena's hand. They slipped through the corridor toward the hidden surveillance room again. The house creaked faintly above them, every sound reminding Dominic of how fragile this moment was. He was rescuing his family from his own household. Inside the surveillance room, Elena opened a drawer and revealed a small flash drive. It contained every file, every recording, every bit of proof of Bianca's abuse and betrayal. She said it needed to be handed directly to law enforcement or the media if anything happened to her. Dominic took it carefully, understanding its weight. It was more than evidence. It was leverage, protection, and the only thing keeping Bianca from controlling everything. He asked Elena what would happen if Bianca discovered them missing before morning. Elena's face hardened. She said Bianca wouldn't stop until everyone was silenced. Dominic's instinct was to call his men, but Elena shook her head again. Bianca's father had already infiltrated his circle. If Dominic reached out to anyone, word would spread, and they'd be trapped before sunrise. She advised going to the garage and using the backup vehicle parked in the far corner. It wasn't registered under his name and could get them to a safe location without being tracked. Dominic hesitated only a second before nodding. He'd made life-or-death choices for strangers. Now he was finally making one for his family. Elena handed him the garage keys and took Arya's hand. The group moved quickly through the back hallways, every light left off to stay hidden. Dominic led the way, gun drawn, his eyes scanning for movement. As they neared the main corridor, they heard Bianca's voice again. She was on the phone, her tone calm and confident, as if nothing was wrong. Dominic froze. Bianca mentioned his name, laughing softly as she told someone that, by tomorrow, he'll sign whatever we put in front of him. Dominic's grip tightened on the gun. Elena tugged at his sleeve, urging him to stay silent. Bianca's footsteps faded into the kitchen. They reached the garage door and stopped. Dominic handed the flash drive to Elena, saying she should keep it in case they got separated. The concrete floor was cold under their feet as they stepped inside. Elena opened the car doors quietly and settled the children in the back seat. Dominic glanced at his watch, 2:55 a.m. They were almost out. But then from upstairs came the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, moving fast. Bianca must have noticed something. Dominic told Elena to start the engine while he stayed near the door. The tension was sharp enough to feel like a knife. Elena didn't argue. The car hummed to life, low and quiet. Dominic waited near the exit, listening. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then continued again, this time heading toward the children's rooms. Bianca would discover the empty beds any second. Dominic gave a quick signal, and Elena began to roll the car toward the gate. The headlights stayed off until they reached the edge of the driveway. Dominic slipped into the shadows, moving alongside. As the gate opened, he saw Bianca appear at the top of the stairs, confusion twisting into fury. She shouted his name into the night. Dominic jumped into the passenger seat, and Elena hit the gas. The car shot through the gate as Bianca's guards began shouting behind them. One raised a weapon, but Dominic fired first, the shot echoing through the quiet streets. The car sped away, leaving chaos behind. In the back seat, Arya began to cry softly while Matteo held her hand, whispering that they were safe now. Dominic turned to look at them, realizing for the first time how fragile they looked, how small they seemed against the darkness. This was no longer about business. It was about survival. They drove in silence for several minutes, the city lights fading behind them. Dominic's shoulder ached from tension, and Elena's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Finally, Dominic broke the silence, asking where they were going. Elena said she knew a place outside the city, a safe house once used by her sister when things got dangerous. It was an old church that had been converted years ago, hidden between two abandoned factories. No one from Bianca's world knew it existed. Dominic nodded. He didn't care what it looked like, as long as it meant his kids were safe. At a red light, Dominic turned and saw Matteo staring out the window, eyes wide and alert. He realized his son wasn't watching the road. He was watching for pursuit. Even at 7, the boy understood danger in a way no child should. Dominic felt the weight of his own mistakes pressing down on him. He had built a life surrounded by violence, and now his children knew its shape better than bedtime stories. He promised himself, silently and firmly, that he'd never let them see this world again. No deal or alliance was worth their innocence. When they reached the edge of the industrial district, Elena slowed the car and turned onto an unmarked gravel road. Ahead stood an old brick church with broken windows and ivy creeping up its sides. She parked behind it, out of sight from the main road. The children stirred, half asleep, now that the adrenaline was fading. Dominic stepped out, scanning the area before motioning them inside. The church smelled of dust and cold stone, yet compared to the house they'd just escaped, it felt sacred. It wasn't beautiful, but it was safe, and that was enough for now. Inside, Elena guided them to a small room that had once been the priest's office. She lit a lantern and locked the door behind them. The flickering light revealed a cot, 2 chairs and shelves filled with old church records. Dominic placed Arya on the cot and draped his coat over her. Matteo sat close, refusing to sleep. Dominic crouched beside them and whispered that everything would be all right. Elena sat quietly in the corner, watching him with an expression that was equal parts sorrow and strength. She had seen men like him before, powerful, broken, and finally human. When the children finally drifted off to sleep, Dominic turned to Elena. He asked again why she'd done all this, why she'd risked her life to expose Bianca when revenge could have been handled another way. Elena said she once believed killing Bianca would bring justice for her sister, but after seeing what Bianca did to innocent children, she realized exposing her would hurt more. Dominic understood. The Mafia world thrived on control, not truth. Taking away Bianca's control would destroy her. Dominic leaned back against the cold wall, realizing he'd met few people brave enough to fight evil with evidence. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out another file, this one containing copies of bank statements, legal documents, and medical reports, showing traces of poison in Dominic's bloodstream. She said Bianca had already started dosing him. The symptoms he'd been ignoring, headaches, dizziness, nausea, weren't stress. They were proof. Dominic felt sick just hearing it. He had thought those moments were fatigue from endless work. Now he saw them as signs of a slow assassination. Elena gave him a small vial of medicine to counter the effects temporarily. It wasn't a cure, but it might keep him alive until morning. Dominic swallowed the medicine without hesitation. The bitterness coated his tongue, a reminder of how deep the betrayal went. Elena told him they needed a plan. They couldn't just hide. Bianca would send people looking, and they'd tear apart half the city to find him. Dominic nodded, knowing she was right. His old instincts began to return, not the ruthless kind, but the strategic kind. He'd built empires by thinking 2 steps ahead. This time he'd use that same skill to save his family. He would dismantle Bianca's power piece by piece, starting with the evidence in his hands. They discussed what to do next. Elena suggested giving the recordings to the FBI, but Dominic refused. He didn't trust law enforcement, not after years of paying them to look the other way. Instead, he decided to leak the evidence anonymously to a journalist known for exposing corruption. Elena agreed reluctantly. It was risky but might protect the children better than any official investigation. Dominic's phone buzzed with an unknown number. He ignored it, knowing Bianca would be calling everyone she could reach by now. She would soon realize she'd lost control, and that would make her dangerous. The first signs of dawn began to appear through the cracked stained glass. The colors bled across the floor, painting Dominic's face in fragments of red and blue. He hadn't slept too wired from everything that had happened. Elena checked on the children, covering them again as the temperature dropped. Dominic stood by the window, watching the city skyline in the distance. He wondered how much of his life was about to disappear. His business, his reputation, his alliances. He didn't care. The only thing that mattered now was ensuring his children never had to live in fear again. As the morning light grew stronger, Elena walked over and told Dominic that Bianca's reign was over. She had everything they needed to destroy her. Dominic didn't answer right away. He just looked at his children sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. He said that revenge wasn't enough anymore. He wanted freedom for them and for himself. Elena nodded, saying freedom came with a price, but it was worth paying. Outside, distant sirens echoed across the city. Somewhere in that chaos, Bianca Marino was realizing that the man she tried to break had just started fighting back. Elena woke Dominic gently, her voice steady but urgent. She had checked her phone and found messages from unknown numbers, all threatening in tone. Bianca's men were already searching the outskirts of the city. Dominic sat up immediately, his fatigue replaced by cold focus. He knew Bianca wouldn't stop until she found him. He told Elena they needed to move again before daylight fully exposed them. The children stirred, still half asleep, unaware of the danger closing in. Dominic promised them breakfast soon, hiding the fear in his voice with the calm authority they always trusted. They packed quickly, taking only what they could carry. Elena erased the files from the laptop in the church, but kept the flash drive and her phone. Dominic carried the gun in his coat, ready for trouble. Outside, the morning was gray and quiet. They drove off using the same unmarked car, heading north toward the old industrial zone. Dominic had a friend there once, a mechanic named Rocco who owed him favors. If Rocco hadn't switched sides, they might have a safe place to rest. Dominic kept glancing in the mirror, scanning every vehicle that followed too closely. Halfway down the highway, a black SUV appeared behind them. Elena's hands tightened on the wheel. Dominic told her to stay calm and keep driving. The SUV maintained distance for several minutes, then began closing in. Dominic knew this pattern too well. He told Elena to take the next exit fast. The car screeched onto an old service road lined with trees. The SUV followed, headlights flashing. Dominic lowered his window and fired 2 shots at the tires. The second shot hit. The SUV swerved violently, crashing into a guardrail. Elena didn't slow down. She drove faster into safety. After a few miles, Dominic told her to stop by an abandoned warehouse. They pulled inside, shutting the door behind them. The silence after the chase felt almost deafening. The children sat in the back seat, frightened but quiet. Dominic checked the perimeter, ensuring no tracking devices were attached to the car. Elena joined him, clutching the flash drive tightly. She said they couldn't keep running forever. Dominic agreed, but added that they couldn't confront Bianca until they had more allies. He needed one person he could still trust, a man from his past who valued loyalty above everything. That man was Vincent Russo, an old associate who'd walked away from organized crime years ago. He owned a farm on the outskirts of Joliet, living quietly with his family. Dominic told Elena they'd go there next. If Vincent agreed to help, they could hide the children while he and Elena exposed Bianca. Elena was hesitant. She had learned not to trust anyone connected to Dominic's world, but he assured her that Vincent was different. He had saved Dominic's life once, and more importantly, he'd lost his own wife because of a feud with the Marino family. They arrived at Vincent's farm just before noon. The place looked peaceful, surrounded by open fields and rusted equipment. Dominic stepped out cautiously, leaving his gun visible. After a long pause, Vincent appeared from the barn, holding a shotgun but lowering it as soon as he recognized Dominic. The two men stared at each other for a moment before Vincent gave a slow nod. "You're in trouble," he said simply. Dominic smiled faintly, replying, "You have no idea." Vincent led them inside, where his wife served warm food without asking questions. For the first time, the children smiled faintly. While the children ate, Dominic and Vincent sat in the living room. Dominic told him everything, from the abuse to the forged contracts and the poisoning. Vincent listened in silence, his jaw tightening as the story went on. When Dominic finished, Vincent leaned back and sighed heavily. "The Marino family always wanted what wasn't theirs," he muttered. He offered to call a few old friends who still owed him favors, men who'd retired but still had influence. Dominic agreed, but insisted they act quietly. If Bianca caught wind of this alliance, she'd strike harder than before. That night, Elena and Vincent's wife put the children to bed while Dominic and Vincent stepped outside to talk privately. The air smelled of hay and rain. Dominic said he planned to release the evidence publicly, then disappear for good. Vincent raised an eyebrow, asking if Dominic could really walk away from everything he'd built. Dominic looked toward the house where his children slept and said yes, without hesitation. The power, the money, none of it mattered anymore. He just wanted his family alive. Vincent nodded slowly, understanding more than Dominic realized. He agreed to help. By morning, Vincent had arranged a safe line of contact with a journalist he trusted in New York. Elena transferred copies of the evidence from her flash drive to a secure folder. They would send it anonymously within 24 hours. Dominic felt a strange calm settling over him. For the first time, he wasn't plotting revenge or gain, he was planning escape. But before they could send the files, Vincent's phone rang. The caller ID showed a private number. He answered and turned pale. Bianca's men had found one of his old contacts and were interrogating him for Dominic's location. They didn't have much time. Dominic told Vincent to get his family out immediately. Vincent protested, saying he wouldn't abandon him, but Dominic was firm. He couldn't risk more innocent lives. Elena packed quickly while Dominic loaded the car again. As they prepared to leave, Vincent handed Dominic an old revolver, a relic from their past. "In case you forget who you used to be," he said quietly. Dominic nodded, taking it without a word. He looked back at the farmhouse one last time, realizing peace was something men like them only borrowed, never owned. They hit the road again, driving west toward an industrial area Dominic once used for shipments. It had empty warehouses, no neighbors, and plenty of places to hide. Elena watched Dominic closely as he drove. He seemed calm, but his silence carried weight. Finally, she asked what he planned to do when this was over. Dominic said he hadn't thought that far. He only knew he wouldn't raise his children under the same rules that had made him ruthless. He wanted them to know a world without fear. Elena didn't say it, but she wanted that too. When they reached the warehouses, Dominic parked behind one of the old buildings and led them inside. It smelled of oil and rust. They found a small office upstairs with dusty windows overlooking the lot. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe enough for now. Dominic checked the signal on Elena's phone. It was weak, but still connected. She began uploading the evidence to the journalist's secure server. As the progress bar inched forward, Dominic stood by the window, watching the empty street. The quiet was unnerving. Every sound outside felt like a possible threat creeping closer through the silence. Halfway through the upload, a black car pulled up across the street. Dominic's instincts flared. He turned off the lights and motioned for everyone to stay low. The car doors opened, and 3 men stepped out, scanning the area with flashlights. Elena froze, whispering that they might have traced her phone. Dominic cursed under his breath. He told her to grab the kids and move toward the back stairwell. As she did, the men began approaching the building. Dominic stayed near the window, waiting for the right moment. The first intruder kicked the front door open, and chaos began. Gunfire echoed through the metal halls. Dominic fired back from the staircase, dropping one of the intruders instantly. Elena shielded the children behind a stack of crates. The second man rushed in, shouting orders into a radio. Dominic moved fast, using the shadows to his advantage. When the man turned the corner, Dominic struck him across the head with the revolver, knocking him out cold. The third man fled back outside, shouting something into his phone. Dominic knew reinforcements would come soon. He yelled for Elena to finish the upload and destroy the device once it was done. Elena's hands shook as she watched the progress bar hit 98%. Dominic reloaded, pacing between the stairs and the door. The air smelled of gunpowder and dust. Just as the upload finished, another vehicle screeched to a stop outside. Dominic grabbed the phone, yanked out the SIM card, and crushed it under his boot. He told Elena to take the children through the back exit and head toward the train tracks. She refused to leave him behind. Dominic looked at her, his expression a mix of anger and admiration, and said she wasn't giving him a choice. Outside, more engines roared. Dominic could hear at least 2 cars approaching. He knew he couldn't win a full shootout, but he could buy time. He told Elena to trust him one last time. She hesitated, then nodded. Together, they led the children down the back stairs, slipping into the shadows behind the warehouse. Dominic turned and headed back toward the front, revolver ready. The headlights from the approaching vehicles painted long white lines across the ground. He steadied his breath. For the first time in years, Dominic wasn't fighting for power, he was fighting for love and redemption. The first car door opened and Bianca stepped out. She wore a long black coat, her expression calm and composed despite the chaos. "You've made quite the mess, Dominic," she said, her voice echoing across the lot. Dominic aimed the gun but didn't fire. Bianca smirked, saying she only wanted to talk. Behind her, armed men spread out. Dominic told her it was over, the evidence was out, and she had nothing left. Bianca laughed softly, claiming that evidence meant nothing without context, and that she could spin any story she wanted. Dominic realized she truly believed she was untouchable. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the pavement. She called him a fool for trusting a maid, saying Elena had manipulated him for revenge. Dominic didn't react. Bianca's words were sharp, designed to provoke. She said he'd always been too sentimental to lead. Dominic finally spoke, his voice low and steady. He told her that being sentimental was what made him human, something she'd never understand. Her smile faltered for the first time. He warned her to walk away before she lost everything. Bianca's eyes darkened. "You already took everything," she whispered, signaling her men to attack. Gunfire erupted again, deafening and chaotic. Dominic dove behind a concrete barrier, returning fire with precision. 2 of Bianca's men fell instantly, but more poured from the second car. He ducked low, bullets shattering glass above him. Bianca moved toward the car, screaming for her men to bring him in alive. Dominic used the distraction to roll across the floor and take cover behind a forklift. He spotted a gasoline drum nearby and fired a single round into it. The explosion sent flames roaring across the lot. The chaos bought him seconds, but sometimes seconds were everything. Amid the smoke and fire, Dominic slipped through a side door and circled around the building. He could hear Bianca shouting orders, her fury breaking through her calm mask. Dominic met Elena and the children near the train tracks, where the faint rumble of an incoming freight train grew louder. Elena asked if Bianca was dead. Dominic shook his head, saying not yet, but soon. They climbed onto one of the stationary cars near the back. As the train began to move, Dominic held his children close, feeling the heat from the burning warehouse fade behind them like a dying past. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, the rhythmic clatter of the train the only sound. Elena sat across from Dominic, her eyes tired but determined. The children had fallen asleep again, leaning against each other. Dominic's mind replayed Bianca's words, how easily she twisted truth. He knew she wouldn't stop until she was destroyed completely. The evidence might be safe, but Bianca would fight back publicly, claiming innocence. Dominic needed to be ready. Elena reached out, placing a hand on his arm. She told him he'd done enough for one night. He wasn't sure he agreed. When the train slowed near a rural station, they jumped off. landing on damp gravel. The early dawn mist hung low over the fields. Dominic led them toward a nearby diner where truckers gathered before long hauls. They sat in a corner booth trying to blend in. Dominic ordered coffee, while Elena got milk for the kids. It felt almost normal for a moment, just a father with his family. But every sound outside kept Dominic tense. He couldn't shake the feeling that this peace wouldn't last. He was right. A black car pulled up across the street, lights still off. Dominic's eyes narrowed. He told Elena to take the kids to the back exit quietly. She obeyed instantly. He stayed at the table pretending to sip his coffee while watching the door. Two men stepped inside, scanning the room. They didn't recognize him at first, but when one caught his reflection in the window, their expressions changed. Dominic stood slowly, gun in hand beneath the table. The moment they reached for their weapons, he fired twice. The noise shattered the calm morning. Customers screamed and ducked for cover. Dominic rushed out the back door, meeting Elena and the kids in the alley. They ran through the narrow alleys, the sound of sirens already approaching. Dominic knew someone would call the police. He didn't want to involve them, but it was inevitable now. He led the group toward a row of old storage buildings by the tracks. Inside one they found temporary shelter. Dominic sat against the wall, catching his breath. Elena checked the children for any injuries, finding none. Dominic's hands trembled slightly, adrenaline still pulsing through him. He looked at Elena, saying Bianca had just made her biggest mistake by forcing him into a corner. She had given him nothing left to lose. As the sirens faded into the distance, Dominic stood and looked out the small window. The sky was turning pale gold. He realized that every bridge he'd ever built was burning behind him, one by one. Yet, for the first time, he didn't care. Elena asked what he planned next. Dominic said he was going to end this once and for all. Bianca had to be confronted directly, and he knew exactly where she would go next, to the Marino estate to regroup. He turned toward Elena and said quietly, "We finish this today, or we don't survive tomorrow." Dominic and Elena left the storage building before sunrise. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. The Marino estate sat 2 hours away, surrounded by forested land and high walls. Dominic knew every path, every security checkpoint, every weakness. He'd been there countless times when trust still meant something. Now it felt like walking into a battlefield. Elena carried the flash drive tucked under her coat, while Dominic kept his revolver close. The plan was simple: get inside, confront Bianca, and end it before her father's men could rally. There would be no more running after today. As they drove, Dominic explained that Bianca's father kept a panic vault beneath the estate, stocked with documents and servers. If they could access it, they'd find proof of every crime the Marino family had ever covered. Elena listened intently, realizing this wasn't just about personal revenge anymore. It was about exposing a legacy of corruption that had destroyed countless lives. Dominic's voice was calm but heavy. He didn't expect to survive this. Elena knew it too, though neither of them said it out loud. The children stayed asleep in the back seat, unaware of what awaited their father. They parked the car a mile from the estate, leaving it hidden behind thick brush. Dominic led the way on foot, moving quietly through the damp morning air. The woods were silent, except for the crunch of leaves under their boots. When they reached the perimeter fence, Dominic cut through it with a pair of pliers he'd taken from the warehouse. The estate loomed ahead, 3 stories of stone and glass, cold and elegant. Security cameras rotated slowly across the grounds. Dominic timed their movement, signaling Elena when it was safe to cross. Every second mattered now. They slipped through the garden entrance, staying low behind the hedges. Dominic recognized the faint smell of jasmine, Bianca's favorite scent, always overpowering. It made his stomach turn. Inside the mansion, faint lights glowed from the upper floors. Dominic guessed Bianca hadn't slept, likely waiting for word about his death. Elena followed close, her hand steady on the small pistol Vincent had given her. The door to the study was ajar, and voices drifted out. Bianca was speaking to someone over the phone, her tone sharp and impatient. Dominic motioned for silence and crept closer to listen. Bianca's words were clear now. She was furious that her men hadn't found Dominic or the children. She accused them of betrayal, saying she'd handle things personally. Dominic could hear her pacing, heels tapping against the marble. She told the caller that the FBI was already sniffing around after a journalist leaked files about her father's offshore accounts. Dominic allowed himself a grim smile. The evidence had reached its destination. Elena exhaled softly in relief, but Bianca's next words froze them both. She said she was leaving the country tonight with the kids. She believed they were still in her control. Dominic stepped into the doorway, gun raised. Bianca turned sharply, her expression shifting from shock to something colder. "You're supposed to be dead," she said, almost admiringly. Dominic's voice was quiet but firm. He told her the evidence was already out, her empire crumbling. Bianca tilted her head, smirking. "Empires don't crumble," she said. "They change hands." Dominic took a step closer, keeping the gun steady. She didn't flinch. Her confidence unnerved him. Elena entered behind him, pointing her pistol at Bianca. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with everything unsaid between them. Bianca laughed softly, lowering herself into the leather chair behind her desk. "You think this ends with me?" she asked. "My father built this city's silence." Dominic replied that her father's silence was already broken. Bianca's smile faded slightly. She asked if he really thought the world would care about one more dirty family exposed. Dominic said he didn't care about the world, only about his children. Bianca's eyes narrowed. "Those children were mine to shape," she said coldly. Elena's hand trembled slightly on her pistol, fury rising in her chest. Dominic took a step forward and said, "Not anymore." Bianca stood and walked slowly around the desk, circling Dominic like a predator. She taunted him about how easily he'd been fooled, how she had poisoned his drinks for months, and how he'd smiled through it. Dominic didn't respond. His calm unsettled her. She stopped inches from him, eyes blazing. "You could have ruled everything," she hissed, "but you traded power for pity." Dominic leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper, saying pity was the only thing keeping her alive. The moment hung heavy, both of them knowing one move would end everything between them forever. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Bianca turned slightly, distracted. Dominic seized the moment, disarming her with a swift motion. The gun clattered to the floor. Elena kicked it away, keeping her weapon aimed steady. Bianca stumbled back, but instead of fear she laughed. "You think I didn't plan for this?" she sneered. From the hall, 2 guards appeared with rifles. Dominic pulled Elena behind the desk, bullets splintering the wood above their heads. Bianca ducked behind a pillar, shouting orders. The study erupted into chaos, marble and glass shattering under the relentless gunfire. Dominic reloaded, whispering to Elena to move toward the side exit. They crawled low, staying hidden behind overturned furniture. Bianca's voice echoed through the smoke, mocking them, saying no one leaves her house alive. Dominic spotted a reflection of one guard in a broken mirror and fired, dropping him instantly. The second one panicked, retreating toward the hallway. Dominic took the chance to move forward. Elena followed, covering him. As they reached the exit, Bianca fired blindly, the bullet grazing Dominic's shoulder. He winced, but didn't stop. They burst into the corridor, running toward the vault room downstairs. They descended the spiral staircase into the basement, the walls lined with paintings and antique statues. The air grew colder as they reached the bottom. Dominic knew this place well. Bianca's father had always bragged about his legacy room. The vault door stood at the end of the corridor, sealed with a biometric lock. Dominic placed his hand on the scanner, and to his surprise, it still recognized him. The lock clicked open. Inside, shelves stacked with hard drives, cash, and documents lined the room. It was a treasure chest of evidence that could dismantle half the city's criminal web. Elena rushed to the nearest table, scanning the documents. She found ledgers listing bribes, trafficking routes, and offshore transfers. Dominic grabbed a portable drive and began copying files from one of the computers. Above them, faint shouting echoed. Bianca was calling for reinforcements. They had minutes, maybe less. Elena looked at Dominic, urging him to hurry. He nodded, sweat dripping down his temple. The computer beeped, confirming the transfer complete. Dominic pocketed the drive. Elena found a small black box labeled Isabella. Her hand trembled as she opened it. Inside were medical records, showing Isabella's car accident had been staged. Dominic froze as he read the documents. They confirmed what he'd always feared but never proved. His wife's death wasn't an accident. Bianca's father had arranged it after Isabella tried to pull Dominic out of the business. Bianca had known all along. The paper crumpled in Dominic's fist. His breathing grew shallow, rage flooding through him. Elena whispered his name, trying to ground him, but it was too late. The part of him that had wanted peace burned away. He turned toward the door, eyes hard. "She took everything from me," he said quietly. "Now I'll take everything from her." They climbed back up the stairs, the mansion now echoing with chaos. Guards shouted orders while smoke filled the hall from a small fire upstairs. Dominic moved like a man possessed, firing with precision, clearing the way as they advanced. Elena followed close, terrified but unwavering. When they reached the main hallway, Bianca was waiting near the grand piano, holding a pistol. Her face was smeared with blood and fury. "You should have stayed gone," she hissed. Dominic raised his gun but hesitated. Bianca aimed first, shooting toward him. The bullet missed his heart by inches, grazing his ribs. Pain tore through Dominic's side, but he fired back, hitting Bianca's arm. She screamed, dropping her gun. Elena rushed forward, kicking it away again. Bianca fell to her knees, clutching her bleeding arm, still defiant. "You think this ends with me?" she spat. "My father will burn you to ashes." Dominic stepped closer, holding her at gunpoint. "Your father's empire is ash already," he said, "and you'll watch it fall before I walk away." Bianca's expression flickered between rage and disbelief. For the first time she seemed afraid, not of dying but of losing control. Elena heard sirens in the distance, faint but growing louder. Someone must have called the police or the FBI, after the explosion, earlier. Dominic knew time was running out. He motioned for Elena to take the flash drive and leave through the service exit. She refused. Bianca laughed weakly, taunting them both, saying they'd never make it out alive. Dominic's voice hardened. "You're right," he said. "But at least they'll know what you did." He pulled out his phone and opened the live camera feed. The call connected directly to the journalist channel. Everything Bianca said next would be recorded. Bianca realized too late what was happening. Dominic pointed the camera at her, demanding she explain the files about Isabella and the abuse. She tried to deny it at first, but Dominic's questions came fast and sharp. Under pressure, her composure cracked. She shouted that Isabella was weak, that Dominic needed someone ruthless beside him. Every word went straight to the live feed. Elena watched in stunned silence as Bianca exposed herself, confessing to manipulation, poisoning, and lies. The live stream had over 1,000 viewers within minutes. Bianca's empire wasn't falling in secret anymore, it was collapsing publicly. The sirens grew louder, now joined by the sound of approaching helicopters. Bianca's hand trembled as she realized what she'd done. Dominic lowered his gun slowly, the anger in his eyes replaced by exhaustion. He said she would live long enough to face the world she created. Bianca lunged suddenly, grabbing a shard of glass from the floor. Elena fired once, the shot echoing through the hall. Bianca collapsed instantly, the glass slipping from her hand. Silence filled the mansion. Smoke curled through the air as the last echo of gunfire faded into nothing. Dominic just stood there, unmoving. Elena lowered her gun, breathing heavily. She didn't want to kill Bianca, but it had been instinct. Dominic walked toward Bianca's body, kneeling beside her. For a moment, he just looked at her face, once beautiful, now broken. "It didn't have to end like this," he murmured. He closed her eyes with a trembling hand, and stood. The flashing red lights outside grew brighter, reflecting through the shattered windows. Elena asked what they would tell the authorities. Dominic said nothing. He just told her to get the children and go. She shook her head, refusing to leave him behind again. They moved together toward the back exit, but before they could reach it, the front doors burst open. Agents in tactical gear stormed the mansion, shouting for everyone to drop their weapons. Dominic raised his hands slowly, the gun still in his grip. Elena did the same. The agents quickly surrounded them, demanding explanations. Dominic handed over the flash drive, saying it contained everything they needed. The lead agent looked confused but accepted it. As they were led outside, Dominic glanced at the rising sun. It painted the sky crimson, the same color as every decision he'd ever made. Outside, the estate was swarming with law enforcement. News crews had already arrived, cameras flashing. The chaos looked unreal, like the end of a kingdom. Dominic saw his children waiting near one of the police cars, wrapped in blankets, frightened but unharmed. Elena had managed to get them to safety during the final moments. When Arya saw him, she ran forward, crying, clinging to his leg. Dominic knelt, holding her tightly, whispering that it was over. Matteo joined them silently, his small hands gripping his father's sleeve. For the first time in years, Dominic's armor cracked. He felt human again. The agents took statements for hours. Dominic told them everything, leaving nothing out. He didn't ask for immunity or favors. He just wanted protection for his children. Elena gave her testimony next, her voice calm but tired. When it was over, The agents informed them that Bianca's father had been arrested earlier that morning while trying to flee the country. The Marino family's empire was officially dismantled. Dominic didn't smile. The victory felt hollow. Too much had been lost to call it justice. Still, as he looked at his children sleeping in the back seat of the police van, he felt peace. The following days blurred together. Dominic and Elena were placed under protective custody, kept in a safe house near the outskirts of the city. The media painted Dominic as both villain and victim, a fallen king caught in his own empire's collapse. Elena stayed by his side, caring for the children, helping them adjust. Matteo began to speak again, slowly letting go of his fear. Arya laughed for the first time in months. Each sound healed something broken inside Dominic. He began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was life after everything they'd endured. Weeks later, Dominic was summoned to testify before a federal hearing. He wore no suit, no watch, just a plain shirt. The prosecutors wanted his insight into the Marino network, but Dominic gave them something else: truth. He told them about greed, loyalty, and how power blinds men until they forget what love looks like. The courtroom was silent. Elena sat in the back with the children, watching him speak with honesty instead of control. When it ended, the judge thanked him for his cooperation. Dominic walked out of that courthouse feeling lighter than he ever had before. That night, Dominic and Elena took the children to a small park outside the city. The air smelled of rain and spring grass. They sat on a bench as the children played, their laughter echoing through the quiet evening. Dominic turned to Elena and said he didn't know what came next. She smiled faintly and replied that starting over was easier when you had nothing left to lose. Dominic looked up at the stars and whispered a silent promise to Isabella, the wife he lost, that their children were safe now. For the first time it felt true. In the weeks that followed, Dominic's world shrank to quiet mornings and court visits. He was no longer the feared name whispered in backrooms, but a man rebuilding from ashes. The authorities seized most of his assets, but he didn't fight it. He let them take everything except the house where his children stayed under protection. Elena handled most of the logistics: new school forms, therapy sessions, small routines to bring back normalcy. Dominic spent his days trying to learn what being a father truly meant. The silence that used to suffocate him now brought a strange kind of peace. One afternoon, while Dominic sat watching Matteo and Arya draw on the kitchen table, Elena entered with a newspaper. Bianca's trial was set for the following month. She had survived her gunshot wound and was recovering under federal custody. Dominic's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly. Elena asked if he wanted to testify. Dominic shook his head. He said he'd already said enough and that seeing her again wouldn't bring back the years she stole. Elena understood. Revenge had once defined him, but now letting go felt like the only form of power he still wanted. As days passed, Dominic began working quietly with federal investigators, offering guidance to dismantle remaining Marino operations. He didn't seek protection or reward, he only wanted safety for his children and closure for those hurt by the family's empire. The agents respected him, though they didn't trust him fully. Dominic didn't care. Each document he signed, each confession he gave, felt like shedding a layer of the man he used to be. Elena often found him late at night, staring out the window, lost between guilt and relief, the two emotions that never seemed to leave his side. Elena, too, struggled with her own ghosts. She visited Lucia's grave for the first time since the truth surfaced. Dominic accompanied her, standing quietly as she placed flowers and whispered apologies to her sister. The wind carried her words across the cemetery, soft and broken. Dominic felt something shift inside him, an understanding that redemption wasn't earned in one moment, but through every act afterward. When they left, Elena said she could finally breathe again. Dominic nodded. He didn't know if forgiveness was possible for him, but being there for her made him feel closer to something like it. A month later, Bianca's trial began. The courtroom overflowed with cameras and reporters, eager to witness the downfall of one of Chicago's most powerful families. Dominic chose not to attend, but he followed the updates quietly. The recordings, documents, and confessions had left little room for defense. Bianca appeared in court pale and hollow, no longer the woman who once commanded fear. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, Dominic didn't smile. He simply closed the newspaper and whispered to Elena that it was finally over. She placed her hand over his, replying softly, "Now it's time to live." Life after the trial felt uncertain but peaceful. Dominic bought a small house outside the city under a new name. It had peeling paint and creaking floors, but it was theirs. He fixed broken doors himself, teaching Matteo how to hammer nails and paint walls. Arya planted flowers in the front yard with Elena, her laughter returning brighter each day. Dominic had traded marble floors for cracked tiles, but he didn't miss any of it. Each nail, each laugh, each quiet evening felt like building a new foundation, one not built on fear, but on something real. On one quiet morning, Dominic sat outside drinking coffee when a letter arrived. It was from Bianca, sent from prison. Elena found him holding it unopened for hours. When he finally read it, it wasn't an apology, it was a warning. Bianca wrote that her father had hidden files abroad, with people still loyal to the family. She promised revenge even from behind bars. Dominic folded the letter and burned it in the sink. He wasn't afraid anymore. The fire ate the paper slowly, and when it turned to ash, he felt an old weight lift from his chest. Despite the threats, life went on. Elena started volunteering at a community center nearby, teaching young women job skills and safety awareness. She told Dominic she wanted to give others the strength she once didn't have. Dominic supported her quietly, proud of how far she'd come. He spent more time with the children, cooking, reading, and learning the simple rhythms of normal life. For a man who had commanded armies of criminals, learning to make pancakes without burning them felt like victory. Each small success reminded him that peace wasn't found in power, it was found in presence. One evening, Dominic received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was Vincent Russo. He had kept a low profile since the chaos but called to check in. He said the Merino remnants were dissolving fast, and the city was changing. Vincent laughed softly, saying it felt strange to live without looking over his shoulder. Dominic agreed. They talked for a long time about family, loss, and what it meant to grow old without enemies. When Dominic hung up, he felt a rare calm, knowing the people who survived had chosen peace too. As months passed, Dominic's children began healing in ways he hadn't expected. Matteo joined a local soccer team, shy at first, but finding joy again. Arya spent hours drawing pictures of their new house, filling them with bright colors. Dominic kept every one of them pinned to the fridge. Elena noticed how his once cold eyes softened when he looked at his children now. There was still darkness in him, but it no longer ruled him. The man who once used fear as a weapon was learning to live without it, step by slow, steady step. Spring arrived, and with it came a sense of renewal. The city that once feared Dominic's name barely remembered it now. He liked it that way. He worked part-time at a local construction company under an alias, earning honest wages. His co-workers knew nothing of his past, only that he was quiet and dependable. Elena teased him sometimes, saying the infamous boss was now taking coffee orders like an intern. Dominic smiled, saying he'd take this life any day. There was freedom in anonymity, a gift he once thought was only for ordinary men. Now he understood its worth. One rainy afternoon, Dominic visited a small church near their home. The priest didn't know who he was or what he'd done. Dominic didn't come to confess. He came to sit in silence. The sound of rain on the stained glass filled the empty space. He thought about Isabella, her laugh, her patience, her final words before that fatal accident. He whispered that he was sorry for not seeing sooner what she tried to save him from. For a long time he sat alone, until he felt Elena's hand rest on his shoulder. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Later that week, a package arrived at their door with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of Dominic's family taken secretly in the park, along with a small note. Old debts never disappear. Elena froze, fear flickering across her face. Dominic looked at the photo for a long moment, then tore it in half. He told her not to worry, saying they'd faced worse before, but that night he sat awake by the window, gun beside him, eyes scanning the street. He wasn't afraid for himself anymore, only for the fragile peace they'd finally built. Days turned into weeks, and no one came. The letter had been a scare tactic, nothing more. Dominic began to relax again, though he never let his guard down completely. One morning, as he drove the children to school, Arya asked if he missed their old house. Dominic thought for a moment and said no. She smiled, saying she didn't either. That single answer filled him with quiet relief. They had finally let go of the ghosts of that mansion. The past no longer had power here. What mattered now were the moments they still had left together. Elena began writing a memoir at night, detailing her experiences working in the Vassallo house and her fight to protect the children. Dominic read early drafts, surprised by her strength on paper. She didn't portray herself as a hero, only as someone who refused to be silent. He told her people needed to read it. She smiled, saying maybe one day she'd publish it under a different name. Dominic offered to help her find a publisher, but she declined. Some stories are meant to heal, not sell, she said. Dominic understood better than anyone what that meant. As summer arrived, Dominic decided to take his family on a trip to a quiet lake a few hours north. It was the first vacation they'd ever taken together. The cabin was small, surrounded by pine trees and clear water. The children spent their days swimming and laughing, and at night, they sat by the fire roasting marshmallows. Dominic and Elena watched them in silence, grateful for the simple peace of it all. For once, there were no guards, no secrets, no danger, just family. Dominic felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope that tomorrow might be kind. On their last night at the cabin, Dominic sat by the lake alone. The water reflected the moon, still and quiet. He thought about the people he'd lost. Isabella, Lucia, Vincent's friends, even Bianca, every one of them had shaped the man he'd become. He took out his old wedding ring from his pocket and dropped it into the water. It disappeared beneath the ripples, vanishing into the dark. That simple act felt like closing a door that had been open too long. He whispered goodbye and walked back toward the warm glow of the cabin. He didn't look back. When they returned home, the days grew gentler. Dominic started volunteering at the same center where Elena worked, fixing broken furniture and mentoring young men who'd taken wrong paths. Many of them didn't know who he really was. To them, he was just Mr. D, a quiet man who gave honest advice. One boy asked him once why he worked there, if he used to be rich. Dominic smiled faintly and said, "Because I want you to stay free." The boy didn't understand, but Elena did. It was the closest Dominic had ever come to explaining redemption. Months passed and life began to resemble normalcy. The children thrived in school. Elena's memoir drafts filled several notebooks. Dominic rarely thought about the man he used to be. But sometimes when he caught his reflection in the mirror, he saw hints of that shadow, reminders that redemption doesn't erase sin, it only teaches you how to live with it. One evening he sat with Elena on the porch, watching a storm roll in. She said quietly that she believed Lucia would be proud. Dominic nodded, saying Isabella would be too. For once, both names brought peace instead of pain. That fall, Dominic received word that Bianca had died in prison. The cause was listed as heart failure, though the news hinted at suicide. He didn't speak for a while after hearing it. Elena asked how he felt, but he couldn't find the words. Later that night, he went outside and stood in the cool air, staring at the stars. There was no joy or sorrow, just silence. Bianca had been the last piece of that old world still holding him back. Now there was nothing left of it but memory, and he decided to let even that fade. The years that followed were kind. The children grew strong and happy. Dominic's hair turned gray, but his eyes softened with age. He and Elena never married officially, but they built a life together filled with quiet affection. Every Sunday they visited a small cafe near the lake, where the owner knew their order by heart. People there saw them as a family, nothing more, and that was exactly how Dominic wanted it. The world no longer remembered his name, and he preferred it that way. The less he existed in history, the freer his children could be. One winter morning, Matteo found an old photograph buried in a drawer, a younger Dominic standing beside Isabella, smiling genuinely. He brought it to his father, asking who the woman was. Dominic paused before answering. He said she was someone who taught him what love looked like, even when he didn't deserve it. Matteo nodded, satisfied, and placed the picture on the mantel beside a family photo of their new life. Dominic stared at them side by side for a long time. It didn't feel like guilt anymore. It felt like gratitude for second chances he never thought he'd get. Elena's memoir was eventually finished, though she never published it. Instead, she bound it by hand and gave it to Dominic on his birthday. The cover was simple, brown leather with no title. Inside, she had written a dedication, for those who lost their voice, and for the man who found his soul again. Dominic didn't speak after reading it. He simply held her hand. That night they sat by the fire while snow fell outside, the children asleep upstairs. The warmth of the moment reminded Dominic that redemption didn't come in grand gestures, it came quietly through love. Years later, Dominic's story had faded from the public eye entirely. The Marino family was gone, their empire dismantled. The files he'd helped expose became case studies in corruption, seminars, names blurred, details altered. But for Dominic, the only legacy that mattered was the laughter in his home. He often sat on the porch at sunset, watching his grandchildren play. Elena would tease him about turning soft, and he'd reply that softness was all he'd ever wanted. Each sunset felt like a small victory over the darkness that once ruled his life, proof that peace could outlast pain. On a quiet evening many years later, Dominic sat alone in his chair, the house filled with distant laughter. His children and grandchildren were visiting, the air alive with warmth. He smiled faintly, closing his eyes as he listened. His heart slowed, calm and steady. Elena found him minutes later, peaceful and still, a soft smile frozen on his face. She didn't cry right away, she just held his hand and whispered, "You kept your promise." Outside, the sky burned gold and red, the same colors that once symbolized violence, now painting the perfect end to his story. The house grew quiet after Dominic's passing. Elena sat beside him for hours before calling anyone. She didn't see his death as tragedy, only completion. When the children arrived, they surrounded him in silence. Matteo, now a man with streaks of gray in his hair, knelt beside his father, tears running down his face. Arya placed a photo of their family on his chest. Elena whispered that he had finally found peace. For the first time in a long while, the air in the house felt light, as if the ghosts that once haunted it had gone too. The funeral was small and private, just family and a few old friends. No reporters, no secrets, no fear. Vincent's son came, speaking quietly about how Dominic had once saved his father's life. The priest didn't know Dominic's full story, only that he was a man who had loved deeply and fought hard to make things right. Elena listened as people shared memories of the man he became, not the one he once was. When the coffin was lowered into the earth, she placed her hand on it and whispered, "You kept your word, you brought them home." After the funeral, life continued in its quiet rhythm. Elena stayed in the same house, surrounded by reminders of the years they had rebuilt together. Matteo took over her volunteering work, saying it was what his father would have wanted. Arya became a social worker, helping children who came from violent homes. Dominic's legacy wasn't written in newspapers or headlines, but in the kindness that grew from his family's survival. Each person carried a piece of his redemption forward, proof that even the darkest lives could light the way for others. The city never spoke his name again. One night, Elena sat alone by the fire, reading through her old memoir. She hadn't touched it since Dominic died. The pages were worn, the ink fading in places, but the story still pulsed with life. She realized it wasn't just about revenge or survival anymore. It was about transformation. She smiled softly, deciding to add one final chapter. In it she wrote about love, not as something perfect, but as something that saves you even when you think you don't deserve saving. When she finished, she signed her name for the first time. It felt like closure. Matteo visited her the next morning and found her asleep in her chair, the finished manuscript on her lap. He read the final lines, tears filling his eyes. He told her the world needed to hear this story, but Elena only smiled and said the world already had, it just didn't know it. That afternoon she mailed a single copy of the book to a small independent publisher under a pseudonym. She didn't expect fame or money, only that one person might read it and believe change was possible. That was enough. It always had been. Months later, the book appeared quietly on shelves under the title Ashes and Grace. It sold modestly at first, then spread through word of mouth. Readers described it as haunting, redemptive, and real. None knew it was based on true events. The story touched those who had lived through violence or regret, offering hope that it wasn't too late to change. Elena never gave interviews or revealed her identity. She preferred to stay invisible, just as Dominic had wanted. The book became her way of keeping his memory alive, not through fear but through truth. Years passed, and Elena grew older. The house they once shared became filled with laughter, again as grandchildren visited on weekends. Matteo often brought his family, while Arya read bedtime stories to the little ones. They didn't know the full story behind their grandfather's name, only that he had been brave. Elena liked it that way. Some truths were meant to rest quietly, like seeds planted deep in the earth. At night she would sit by the window, watching the stars, and whispering to Dominic that their story had finally become something good. She knew he could hear her. As she aged, Elena began to forget small things, where she left her glasses, which day it was, but she never forgot the sound of Dominic's voice, or the way he used to look at his children. One morning, Arya found her in the garden, pruning the roses Dominic had planted years ago. She said the flowers still bloomed because he never stopped watching over them. Arya smiled, helping her trim the stems. "You still miss him," she said. Elena nodded softly. "Every day," she replied. "But I also feel him everywhere. He's in the quiet, in the peace." When Elena grew too frail to walk the garden, she spent her days by the window, reading letters Matteo and Arya sent from their travels. They often visited schools and shelters, continuing the work she and Dominic had started. Elena was proud of them, not because of success, but because they had learned compassion the hard way and still chose kindness. She wrote back once, telling them that the greatest inheritance their father left wasn't money or safety, it was the courage to love after pain. It became a lesson both children carried for the rest of their lives. One autumn evening, Elena fell ill. The doctor said it was her heart, that it had simply grown tired. She wasn't afraid. She asked Arya to bring her Dominic's old watch, the one that had stopped ticking the day he died. She held it in her palm, smiling faintly. "It's time," she whispered. Arya tried to hold back tears, asking her to rest. Elena nodded, saying she would, but that rest wasn't the same as leaving. That night she closed her eyes, the watch still in her hand. For the first time in decades, her dreams were peaceful. At her funeral, Matteo read a passage from Ashes and Grace. It was the paragraph she had added in her final chapter. Redemption isn't found in confession or forgiveness. It's found in the choice to keep loving after loss. The small crowd listened in silence, many of them unaware that the woman they buried had once helped bring down an empire. Arya placed the watch beside her mother's hand before the coffin was closed. The ticking had never returned, but the sound of the wind through the trees felt like it had. It felt like a heartbeat. After Elena's passing, Matteo and Arya decided to keep the house exactly as it was. They didn't want to erase the memories it carried. Every wall, every photograph told a story of survival. The book she wrote continued to inspire people, though no one knew its origins. Sometimes readers sent letters to the publisher addressed to the author of Ashes and Grace, thanking her for giving them hope. The publisher kept forwarding them to the family, and Arya would read them aloud. Each letter felt like proof that their parents' struggles had created ripples far beyond their lives. One day, Arya visited the old church where Elena and Dominic had once found refuge. The same priest, now older, recognized her from years ago. She thanked him for offering them safety that night, even though he'd never known who they were. The priest smiled and said he remembered their eyes. The father's haunted, the mother's steady. He told Arya that faith was never about holiness, but about choosing good after knowing evil. His words stayed with her as she left. She realized her parents' story wasn't one of crime or tragedy, but of learning to choose love anyway. Matteo, meanwhile, opened a foundation in his father's honor, focusing on helping families escape organized crime. He named it the Vassallo Trust, though few knew why. The organization grew, funding shelters and education programs for children. At its entrance hung a quote from Dominic himself, taken from a private note Elena once kept. "Power means nothing if it can't protect what's pure." Visitors stopped often to read those words, unaware they came from a man once feared by an entire city. It was the quietest kind of redemption, the one that asks for nothing but remembrance. Years rolled forward, and time softened the details of their story. New generations grew up, never knowing the name Dominic Vassallo. To them, he was just a photo on the mantle, a man with kind eyes and a calm smile. But every year, on the anniversary of his death, Matteo and Arya visited the lake cabin. They would bring flowers and sit by the water, telling stories about the life he built from ruin. They didn't speak of the darkness anymore, only of the love that came after it, and how it saved them when nothing else could. One year, as they sat by the lake, Arya's daughter asked who her grandfather really was. Matteo hesitated, then said, "He was a man who made mistakes but never stopped trying to make them right." The child nodded thoughtfully, tossing a flower into the water. "Then he was good," she said. Matteo smiled. "Yes," he whispered, "he was good." The flower drifted slowly toward the center of the lake, where the moonlight reflected off the surface. For a moment Matteo could almost see his father's shadow there, watching quietly, proud of what they'd become. The family returned to the city, leaving the cabin behind once more. Life continued, as it always does, but the lessons Dominic left behind lived on in every choice they made. Arya's daughter grew up kind and brave. Matteo's son became a lawyer who defended the helpless. None of them knew the full story, only fragments, stories whispered at dinners about courage, loyalty, and forgiveness. Yet even without details, they carried the truth in their actions. The Vassallo name, once feared, had transformed into something sacred, a legacy built not on blood, but on grace. As the years passed, the world changed. The city rebuilt itself, the old criminal empires long forgotten, But deep in an archive room of a local university, a researcher came across an anonymous file, evidence from the Marino case. Inside were faded documents, video clips, and notes signed only with the initials DV. The researcher never learned who they belonged to but decided to include them in a study about moral transformation. The story fascinated students who read it, unaware they were studying the life of a man who once walked those very streets in silence. One cold winter, Matteo returned alone to his father's grave. The snow covered everything in white, muffling the world. He knelt beside the tombstone, brushing off the frost. "You'd be proud, Dad," he said quietly. "We kept your promise." The wind rustled through the trees like a whisper in reply. Matteo smiled faintly, feeling the same warmth he used to feel as a boy when Dominic held him close. He left a single white rose on the grave and walked away, the snow crunching softly under his boots, leaving behind footprints that soon vanished in the falling snow. Back at home, Arya sat by the fireplace reading Ashes and Grace to her daughter. The girl loved hearing the story, even though she didn't know it was about her own family. When Arya reached the final line, her daughter asked if it was true. Arya smiled and said it was truer than most stories she'd ever heard. The girl asked what happened to the people after the ending. Arya closed the book gently and said, "They found peace." It was the only ending that mattered, the kind where the pain ends but the love keeps going. That night, as snow fell outside, Arya dreamed of her parents. They stood by the lake, under the same moonlight she remembered as a child. Dominic looked younger, his eyes bright, and Elena stood beside him, smiling gently. Arya called out, but they didn't speak. They just nodded, as if to say they were proud. When she woke, the feeling of warmth lingered. She sat by the window, watching the sunrise. The world outside glowed gold, and for the first time since her mother's passing, she didn't feel alone. Some love, she realized, never fades. It only changes form. Years later, when Arya grew old herself, she often visited that same lake. Sometimes she brought her grandchildren, sometimes she came alone. One morning she placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the shore and whispered, "Thank you." She didn't need to say for what. The water rippled softly in reply. As she turned to leave, a breeze passed through the trees, carrying the scent of jasmine, the same scent that once haunted their mansion, now gentle, almost comforting. She smiled, realizing the past had finally been tamed. Even the ghosts had learned to rest. When Arya passed away peacefully years later, her family found her journal filled with entries about love, loss, and forgiveness. In one she had written, "Our lives began in fear, but ended in grace." The Vassallo name no longer means power, it means peace. Her children and grandchildren read those words aloud at her memorial. They promised to keep that meaning alive, to live with kindness in a world that often forgot it. Dominic and Elena's story had started in violence, but through their children it ended in light. Every generation after carried that quiet legacy forward. Decades later, a historian researching old Mafia families came across the Vassallo name. The records were incomplete, most redacted, but buried in an archive was a note written by a federal agent. One man chose redemption over empire. He changed everything. The historian included it in his book, calling the unknown figure the ghost who chose peace. Readers loved the mystery, unaware the story they admired was real. Somewhere beyond time and memory, Dominic's promise still lived on, not as legend, but as proof that even in darkness, a man can choose the light. And so the story came full circle. The name Dominic Vassallo faded from the streets, but endured where it mattered in hearts changed by the love he fought to protect. The mansion was gone, the empire erased, but the legacy of compassion remained. Generations later, a small girl sat by that same lake, drawing in the sand. When her mother asked what she was making, she said, "A heart for the man who saved us." The mother smiled, not realizing the depth of her child's words. The wind carried the sound of laughter across the water, endless and free.